Grazie. Buongiorno. Grazie per l'introduzione. La mia conoscenza dell'italiano non mi permette di fare tutta la presentazione in italiano. Mi dispiace, devo la fare in inglese. The language of international migration and world. But Italian is beautiful, so it's wonderful to be here. So, okay, so I put as a title for my presentation, the connection between migration, environment, climate change, and then I added prevent or cure. So it's a bit as if you go to the doctor and you speak about a disease. Should we prevent? Should we cure? And I put this on purpose a bit provocatively because I think we speak very often of migration as a disease to be prevented. Personally, I'm also a migrant. I don't feel sick because of this. So I wanted to bring also, maybe in my presentation, a different approach to it. Before I go into my slides, I would like to know who in the audience would say that you are a migrant. Can you raise hands? I see one hand. One, just one. 2, 3. Would you say you are an internal migrant or an international migrant? Would you still raise the hand if you are international? But you didn't raise first. You changed your mind. Okay. Would any of you say that their parents are migrants? Okay. Internal migrants? International migrants? Having crossed a border? Would any of you say that you are an environmental migrant? Would you know anyone who's an environmental migrant? From where? From Africa to Italy. And do you know for what environmental reason? Okay, so the climate change has an impact on the global environment, and the person decided to leave or had to leave? Decided to leave. So I ask this just because before we start talking about environmental migration, we have to try to define a little bit what we mean by it. So when we speak of environment and migration, in fact, we speak about so many different things, and that's why it makes it very difficult, in fact, to size the reality of what we are talking about. And that's why I think it's a very complex issue where very often we have difficulties to identify the environmental, what's really environmental, and even more difficult, climate change impacts as a driver of migration. And where is the environment the main driver? When is it just one among others? In particular, for instance, when climate change aggravates a situation of aridity, of desertification, of coastal erosion. Very often, it's not immediately a causal direct link to migration. Very often, it's about one reason among many others, that it's mixing with demographic, political, economic. If you ask people in research work, why did you migrate? Very often they will tell you because I lost my job. And only if you go one step further and ask, why did you lose your job, you will find that someone in Mali lost it because there has been too many dry years. Someone in Guatemala lost it because the change in rainfall patterns. In Kenya, because there was different desertification patterns, issues around water, issues around land use. Very often, the environmental issue, it's not obvious. So that's why this topic has been, for many, many years, hidden. You look at the migration literature, the migration work, migration policy, it doesn't really speak of the environment. And this has been really changing over the past 10 years. There has been awareness, and it's very interesting to have this presentation in a meeting that speaks a lot about climate change and about environmental change, and to have this human dimension brought into the discussion through the migration perspective. What I put here also to understand that it's a multi-causal phenomenon is not just the environment, as I said before. And that's why it's very often difficult to say we know environmental migrants, because sometimes it's just one element among many others. But we see more and more people moving because of environmental issues. And in this big environment, we have also many different layers of understanding. You have what I call the sudden onset events. It's, for instance, storms, typhoons, immediate disaster situation. And this, in fact, it's much easier to grasp. And we do have data on this. With the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, we work very closely together, and IOM gathers a lot of data through a matrix that tracks displacement. And for instance, we know that last year, over 17 million people were displaced by sudden onset events around the world. And if you make average over the past 10 years, every year, an average of 21 to 22 million people are moving because of these natural hazards. And very often it's just the sudden ones, because we have difficulties to track the movements related to slow onset type of processes. The sudden one, there's a catastrophe, people run away, move out of harm's way, it's easier to grasp. So we do have data on that. And Asia, for instance, is the most impacted continent in terms of displacement due to natural disasters. But it's very complex. Very often, this data that I just mentioned, it's newly displaced every year. But some people remain displaced on long, long years, and others are displaced again and again. And it happens everywhere. It's not just the developing countries. It's as much developing and middle-income undeveloped countries. If you have the example of the typhoons in the United States, for instance. The difficult bit is the slow onset. So slow onset, what does it mean? It means desertification, projected extreme heat. It's about loss of ecosystems, in particular maritime ecosystems, and this can have an impact on fishermen's livelihood and can lead to migration. It's about acidification, lakes disappearing, water resources becoming scarce. So you see there, again, how do you count? We do not know, in fact. And that's the difficulty when you work on this. I work a lot also with media. I'm always asked, so how many are they moving today? And how many in 30 years will be moving because of environmental degradation? And in fact, we have to be sincere in migration. We have to be also evidence-based. And the reality is we do not know how many people will move because of climate change impacts. What we know is that millions of people are at risk. They live, for instance, if you look all the population that lives in low-lying deltas. Not just the small island states, the low-lying deltas. Look at the population that lives in big cities that are on coastal zones. All these people are at risk. It doesn't mean they will become migrants, because migration doesn't work this way. It's not because you are impacted that you have the means to live. But they are at risk, and I think we have to be prepared. And the work we do at IOM, it's the International Organization for Migration, that is the work I represent and I present to you today. It's about finding different kinds of solutions and proposing a reflection on this reality. I put also here climate change as an exacerbating factor, as well as terminology and legal frameworks, because we have a lot of difficulty around the terminology. I think you must hear a lot of climate refugees, but to be a refugee, first of all, you have to cross a border, and to be a refugee, you have to show persecution, and under the Geneva Convention, to be granted a refugee status, you can't show today persecution because of climate change. So in fact, this terminology in legal terms does not exist. You can maybe use it metaphorically if you want to speak about that, but we rather use environmental migrants. If you see the picture, this picture with the Lego, it's in fact a project that I'm doing with kids to understand how climate change impacts people's livelihoods and migration. And I use the picture because I think kids oblige you to speak in simple terms about this reality. And thanks to them, we can explain that, yes, maybe some of it's melting. Yes, there's not enough water in other places. Too much water, not enough water, for instance, can lead to migration. I also dared to put some cartoons in my presentation. And just because one of the bigger myths about environmental migration is that everyone is coming from south to the north and crossing borders, when in fact, in reality, the majority of migration due to environmental change and climate change is internal. And very often, you have to have the means to migrate. That's what I try to say with this cartoon. So I'm saying that migration and climate change, it's a complex equation with many variables. I try to be a little bit mathematically oriented coming here. I'm really bad in mathematics, so it's just a metaphor. And the picture, I picked it also on purpose with happy faces, because I think there's so many different dimensions to this story. Some of it's tragic, what I said, millions of people losing their homes. It's tragic. And some of it's different. It's maybe like all migration stories, on the contrary, a story of hope and embetterment and better life. For the rest of my presentation, what I wanted to show you is just the ways that this whole equation, nexus, connecting human mobility issues and environmental climate change issues is being looked upon from a policy perspective at international level, and how at IOM we try to propose concrete solutions to deal with this. So one side, if you can, I ask you to put on glasses of climate change and environmental people for a second. For many years, we advanced on the issue of migration and climate change in the climate change policy domain. Why? Because I think countries were not ready at all to speak about it in migration policy. Too sensitive. In the climate change, it has been also extremely tough to speak of migrants, because for many climate conferences, the human dimension was not so central. It was more about the nature and ecosystem and the scientific side of it. And little by little, the social dimensions of climate change grew on the agenda. And you have a small example here in the left-hand side, that at the beginning of the climate conferences, we had no books, very few events, maybe one event dealing with this topic. And last year at the climate conference, there were 35 to 40 events just dealing with it. And since COP16 in Cancun, migration entered the climate negotiations. There's been a paragraph on adaptation to climate change and migration. Since the Paris Agreement, migrants are mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement also created a task force of experts on which also IOM sits, that just worked now for 2 years to produce some recommendations that will be presented at the next conference on climate change. So I must say that's very long, years and years of negotiations. I don't know who is going in the room to the climate negotiations. Are you going sometimes? No. And by the way, I think I'm on Streamline of the, no, it doesn't remain among us what I'm saying, so I have to be careful what I'm saying about the climate negotiations, but it's slow, very slow process. But what matters there is that, speaking of migration from our side as migration specialists, it's a huge progress to have this dimension in the climate discussions. It might not seem much, but it's a big step. It gives you anchorage to work with states, in particular the most vulnerable to climate change, for instance, to think whether their national adaptation plans consider human mobility. And it gives us also hope to access the green climate funds, for instance, for activities that will deal with human mobility. So it seems a bit blah, 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 but it's beyond blah, blah, blah. It's also a support to political action and political will. Nevertheless, I put you this little cartoon. I don't know how you say cope in Italian. Second key change is that now it's the migration world that has progressed and changed. So it's the other side of the coin. It's after making big efforts to speak of migration with climate change people, now we make big efforts to speak of climate change and the environment with the migration people. And there's a whole process for a global compact on migration at international level, where states have negotiated a text. And this text also recognizes environmental migration. So if states sign in the compact, they have commitments made on working on environmental migration. What does it mean? I put here some very concrete things. I think we have the problem that very often when we speak of climate change and of migration, we enter very sensitive political grounds and we lose the very concrete and practical dimension of what it means. It means, of course, some climate change policy, but it means also very concrete migration practice, which means, like, for instance, are my consular services abroad ready to support my country in case there is environmental migration, in case people have to cross a border because of a big natural hazard and that leads to a disaster. It can mean, do people who return back home because they couldn't get asylum, can they return with a package of business support or a vision for green jobs, something that's related to sustainable development, to environmental friendly jobs, to water, for instance, management. It can mean also, because you know your people live in very degraded areas or coastal zones at risk, that you move them in advance. So it's about policies that are about planned relocation of populations. Is it your as a country, for instance, if you are a country neighboring another country with a lot of movements of migration, and there's a big natural event happening, are you ready to receive these people, for instance, on temporary visas, or humanitarian visas, or short-term admission? There is a range of different policies and measures that can be put in place that are just concrete and that are not about just the politics of migration. They are just about how you manage this kind of movement. Then I ask you now to put first your climate change glasses on, second your migration glasses on, but in this international world full of complexity, you can put on loads of other glasses on. One key lenses to look at this issue, it's the whole work that is being done on disaster risk reduction, and there's also a big agreement under the Sendai framework where countries have committed to support populations, communities to be prepared if there is a disaster, that they do not end with a huge loss, a huge damage, that they are prepared. And it's also about very concrete issues such as being insured, having your insurance backing you in case of problems, or being educated on how you face, how you will respond to disaster. And there are different also funding strands according to what we talk about. For instance, there are specific disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management strands of funds that can support this action. Then you can put on your glasses that if you're a development person. You can put your glasses on if you are a humanitarian person, if you are working on security and conflict, if you work, for instance, on land and desertification, if you work on urban issues, or if you work on human rights. I think human rights are one of the key responses. Human rights, if they would be applied and all provisions made, we wouldn't maybe even need other type of policies for environmental migrants. But there are advances today in all these agendas. So there is a big change, I think, a shift in the way the political international governance looks at these issues. The question is, how do you move from these big policy frameworks and political agreements to concrete action? What can you do? I forgot I put also the rights approach. So one of the way to go a bit down to the more practical level, it's also the regional level. I think the regional level is one of the spaces where migration, environment, and climate change issues have advanced most over the past, because there is easier for fewer countries sharing different regional concerns to come to different discussions, dialogues, and agreements on a very complicated and difficult topic. Before I go into one more step towards being more concrete, I think one of the big issues we have is the causal link that we often have between migration, environment, climate change, and conflict. And in fact, we realize that in many cases, it's true, conflict has been exacerbated by climate change impacts. We have, unfortunately, for instance, the example even of Syria. But it's very difficult to make a direct causal link between security issues and conflict and migration. And in fact, we work very hard to look at security from a human security lenses and not just state security lenses that puts at the end the human being, the migrant, and the communities that receive them and the communities that send them at the center of our approach. So now I will end my presentation by giving you some ideas on how we work on at IOM. I don't know how many people are aware of IOM. You know the organization? So it's an international organization, it's an intergovernmental organization, and it's a UN organization since 2016. It's the International Organization for Migration. It's the organization that's mandated on migration. It's a very special place to be because it's extremely decentralized. There are, I think, over 11,000 colleagues now in IOM, and there are a lot of work is being done at local level. So my colleagues, when I talk here, they are working with migrants and communities. They have a very hands-on approach. But now, as a UN organization, we also have to deal with the policies and the politics of it. How can we try to respond to this big challenge of environmental migration? So, IOM is the first organization that created division, let's say a unit in its organization that deals with migration and environment and climate change that I'm now representing and heading in the organization. Because it had a vision that you can't do contemporary migration policy and practice and ignore climate change and environmental issues. So we try to simplify our messaging on what does it mean concretely? What can you do? So what can we do? One big chunk, it's about solutions for people to stay. So it's about what can you do to help people not to move in a forced way. So that's all about investing in climate policy, mitigation, adaptation. It's about investing in natural resources management, in land management. So it's about our work in supporting actors that believe and act for the environment so that we address climate change and the environmental drivers as adverse drivers of migration. So the objective is to give people a choice that they do not have to move. And that's one of the big also illusions we have of migration, that people just want to move, when we realize that many people just don't want to move. They want to stay home. Second big chunks is what I call the solution for people on the move. So that's a reality check. As I said, environmental migration is happening. So because it is happening, and many people are in need of assistance, of protection, we realize there is much more trafficking when there's a natural disaster, for instance. Because of this, we have to have rather humanitarian types of solutions that support people on the move. And the third big chunk, it's solutions for people to move. What I mean by there, it connects with what I presented on migration policies. It's to realize, because there is climate change, because hundreds and millions of people will live, for instance, in extreme heat zones or in areas submitted to coastal erosion. We know this already, so we can already plan for more innovative perceptions and policies of migration. For instance, labor migration for Colombian very degraded areas to be able to go, for instance, to Spain and return. It can be also diasporas from Ghana or Gambia who are in Italy but work in environmental domains, areas, and want to reinvest back home into green economy in the home country of origin. So that's all about looking at migration as a possible part of the solution. So I added to my introductory message, not just prevent, which would mean not letting people go, not just cure, which means that we are a bit facing a situation that will happen, but also prepare. So it's about minimizing, about addressing, about making it possible, making migration in dignity and in legal ways a possibility, but also investing in climate action to allow people not to be forcibly moved. I put here some example of our books, and I encourage you to look in our Atlas of Environmental Migration, where we speak a lot about the myth of migration, environment, and climate change. Speaking of a myth, I will present this. To conclude my presentation, I want to invite you also to have a look. We have a portal of environmental migration that is full of ideas and example of projects, of research, of policy work, of our work with government. As a clin d'oeil, I put you this because we are in Italy. It doesn't have anything to do with the environment. It has to do with Italian food.